Secretary General of On the Move, the Cultural Mobility Information Network, active in Europe and internationally, and we are co-funded by the European Commission and the French Ministry of Culture. And this particular forum is co-funded by the European Union. As many of you may know, this is the second time the forum is held. Last year it was in Helsinki and the focus was on artistic mobility and digital mobility. And this year we have in Tunis, in Tunisia, this particular focus on artistic mobility and environmental sustainability. So as I mentioned it is held in Tunis, but also online. So we have also not only the people in the room here physically in Tunis, but also we are close now to 300 people that register for the online session, so which means also the interest for this particular topic. I have a couple of organizations that we need very much to thank because we have different venues where the forum is being held, where also some other events for On the Move member, guests and participants of the Mobility Developers Workshop are taking place. I would like to thank our local supporter, the EU delegation to Tunisia, and our local partner, and I will start, of course, with this wonderful place of El Hamra, which is directed by Sirin Ganoun. Sirin is here today, so if you want to applaud her for this wonderful place, thank you very much. It's really unique. And if you want to talk to Sirin later, you can. Of course, she will be with us this morning and after that. Yesterday, we were also in another very symbolic place, El Teatro. We would like also to thank the Institut Français de Tunisie, the Creative Europe Desk, la Cité de la Culture, Dar Ben Gassem, La Rue, Massart, Dar Sadika, Darsana, Kouri Keredin. And of course, we have to thank our wonderful partner, Culture Funding Watch, and I am now passing the floor to Wafa Belgassem.
Thank you very much, Marie. So for those who don't know me, no, I'm kidding. So I'm Wafa Belgassem. I'm the founder of CFW, but I'm also a member and board member of On the Move. Very, very, very happy that you bring me on board, but I'm mostly more happy to have you here. I'm really, really very happy that we would be able to go through all those spaces so you can connect with the culture creative community here in Tunisia. So I welcome you again. I want to have a thought as much as same as for yesterday. These kind of spaces, they have talent, but there is always a spirit in there. And in this space, there is Azdin Ganoun, the founder. He left us for a while, but he's always here. His legacy is through his daughter is there. But these spaces carry more than the talent. They carry founders and spirits. So Azdin, wherever you are, thank you again for this place.
Thank you very much, Wafa, and also always to remind us where we are. I mean, also like to contextualize this meeting and this particular panel session this morning. I am now passing the word to my colleague, Johan Flock, Director of Operation at On the Move for the introduction of the panel this morning in connection, of course, with the panel of yesterday.
Thank you very much. I'm indeed very happy to be in this wonderful space, and I'm very happy to start and introduce this second day. It could be a short introduction. Yesterday, I felt you saw a lot of me and heard a lot of me. Again, a quick description of myself for participants with visual impairments that could be online. I'm a white man in my mid-40s. I have graying hair, facial hair, and I'm wearing glasses to read my very short speech, I promise. This morning, we have two panel discussions. Yesterday, we heard how the words sustainability and mobility resonate in a very different way when we unfold this conversation in a non-Western perspective. And we see how this green transition resonate very differently. according to the context we start or unfold, unpack many of the keywords and the buzzwords we use. This morning we will have a panel that will be dedicated to sustainable transcontinental cultural relations and South-South mobility, where we will discuss the paradox of promoting international cultural relations and valuing cultural diversity when transcontinental relations seem to clash with pledges to work in more sustainable ways, let alone greener modes of transportation. As the facilitator of this panel said already, and I'm quoting her, addressing the ecological crisis within international cultural relations is inseparable from the need to address widespread inequalities in the cultural sector, acknowledge privileges, and strive for equity in international cultural relations. During this particular panel, I hope that the facilitators and the guest speakers will be able to discuss how the Sustainable Development Goals can provide a renewed framework for these international cultural relations. But we have a first panel. And in this first panel, we have a theme that is, I would say, very intertwined with all the other topics we started to investigate. It is focusing on sustainable local strategies and cultural impacts. And already yesterday, we started to discuss the very term impacts. While addressing the climate emergency, many cultural agents work toward responding local challenges. And even if climate change threatens the development of local creativity, these impacts, these opportunities, forces the creatives sometimes out of the sector or even out of their country, which generates cultural poverty. In this panel, I'm sure we will hear about sustainability in its many dimensions. And to lead this panel, I'm calling on stage Fairooz Tamimi. Fairooz, please come and join me. Fairooz is a wonderful human being and the Director of Strategic Development at Trans-Europa. She's been working in the arts and culture for many, many years, even if she looks like a 20-year-old.
I love you, Johan.
And she was the Executive Director of the Arab Fund for Arts and Culture and a fund manager of the Royal Film Commission in Jordan. But she's also a journalist, a writer, an activist, a thinker. And I thank you very much for leading this conversation.
Thank you.
And I let you introduce your two panelists. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Johan. Thank you. And good morning to you all. I hope you had a very good evening and dinner last night. Did you sleep well? Perfect. So I'm so happy. Thank you, Johan. I will start by describing myself. I'm a woman of color in my mid-50s. I'm not that tall, and I have gray hair. And I will start by telling you a little bit about, I think Johan did a very good job with the introduction of the panel, and I will introduce our two panelists. So I will invite Mike Van Graan and Sarah Abdu Bushra. Please join me on stage. And thank you. So this panel, we will start discussing the experiences of our guests, of our panelists, Mike and Sarah. And then we will have some time for Q&A, so we will have a good 20 minutes at the end. I will start with Mike. So Mike, you are a playwright and you are the founder of a stand or coordinator of stand. STAND stands for Sustaining Theatre and Dance Foundation in South Africa. And you have very extensive experience, like in so many fields. So I will let you walk us through your experience related to the topic of this panel, please.
I think it might be better to forget about the introduction and maybe just concentrate on the content, because I think we've lost quite a bit of time. I'll integrate what I do into the kind of responses, if you don't mind.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah? Thank you. And Sarah, you are the curator of arts, performing arts and visual arts exhibitions in Ethiopia. And you are the founder of Contemporary Nights. And would you tell us a bit more about you and Contemporary Nights and the cultural scene in Ethiopia?
Okay, thank you. Should I then also follow the topic as discussed? Yeah. So Contemporary Nights is a curatorial collective. It's a collaborative work between myself, curator of visual and performing arts exhibitions, and Dawit Seto, who's a performing artist who specializes in contemporary African movements. So in Contemporary Nights, we work with artists from different disciplines, and we organize a program called Gojo Artistic Residency. We invite artists to come and think, starting from the idea of homemaking and responding to the current realities that are taking place in Addis Ababa. Our residency program is called Gojo. Gojo is an Amharic word. It means home, and it also means nest. And that's how we sort of integrated with the idea of homemaking and the infrastructures that make up our home. So Contemporary Nights as a collective, it is situated in the alternative artistic movement in Addis Ababa. The artist residency that we organized have now transformed into artistic companionship so that it also embodies the idea of intimacies with the artists that we work with. And the idea of the residency is also for us to come together and address the immediacies and the intimacies that take place in Addis Ababa. And we consider our time together, which is usually 6 weeks, 6+ weeks, as a site for knowledge production, where we converse on ways of drawing, documenting, and also disseminating this knowledge that is produced during our time together. And we also describe our work as a way of facilitating the emergence of methodologies that are inspired from the lived experiences of artists that are based in Addis, basically. So we have so far had 3 editions of this residency, and each notion grapples with this idea of contemporary reality of living and working in Addis Ababa. For example, in the second iteration, artists were responding to the civil war that had broken out in Ethiopia. And they were working from a space of anxiety, and they were trying to articulate and find the words and the language of resistance and as a way of like speaking for the public. And this is, and these are artists working within a space that there is a historical root of language paralysis, usually particularly in times of political crisis in Ethiopia. So I'll share a quote from I will share a work from one of the artists that sort of touches on this idea of sustainability. One of the resident artists working with this idea of art as resistance, he's a photographer, Jamal Muhammad. He had produced a text-based installation at the end of this residency. We put up exhibition, and for this exhibition, he produced a text-based installation that had a quote that said, "Are you looking for permanence here, where precarity is by design?" So what he does with his work is explore practices that push back against systems that sort of disguise precarity as something desirable, as something that we work towards. And he's using the practice of remembrance and reiteration as the way to sort of anchor in terms of remembering identity, remembering our values, or remembering the why of why we do these things as the root and as an anchor as all things around it change. So he also asked the question if there is a constructive outlook towards impermanence, like, for example, the inevitability of the passing of time and how to allow time to pass and sit within that discomfort. Yeah, I guess this is part of
Thank you so much, Sarah. Yeah, great. Thank you. And I will ask you, Mike, because you worked across the continent and you have worked on so many different areas. Can you give us like just a view of the scene in the continent in connection to the topic of our panel?
Sure. When Johan was describing the panel or the workshop yesterday, I was reminded of my time in Arterial Network, which was a network of people engaged in the arts and culture within Africa and the contribution of these to democracy and human rights and development on the continent. And I worked as the Secretary General of that for about 6 years. And in fact, the person who followed me was Wafa, and we shared an office in Cape Town for a year or so. And we've been talking about, coming to Tunis for the last however many years, and so I'm delighted to be here. But when Johan was kind of speaking about the workshop concentrating on sustainability and on climate change in particular, I was reminded of, the cultural policy kind of work that we did within Arterial Network, where we joked about how that we used to embrace cultural policy coming from the global north. So 2 weeks ago, it would have been, the emphasis would have been culture and development. Last week, it was creative industries. The day before, it would be intercultural dialogue, and then it would be fundamentalism and culture. The day after would be cultural diplomacy. And so here we are talking about sustainability with an emphasis on climate change. And I just want to say that within Arterial Network and working across the continent, sustainability has never had this singular focus. When we've spoken about and run workshops on sustainability, we've used for external factors, if you had to understand what sustainability is, how does an organization or activity continue indefinitely or for as long as we would like it to be? One would then need to consider what are the external factors and the internal factors that militate against an organization or an activity continuing indefinitely. So we used to use what we call the PESTEL analysis, PESTEL plus C analysis, P for politics, the political terrain in which we were working. And more than 2/3 of African countries are authoritarian or hybrid political systems, where it's very difficult for people to operate freely within those kinds of spaces. Many of the countries, at least 1/3 of African countries, are facing some form of violent conflict. Again, very difficult to be a sustainable entity in those kinds of situations. E of PESTEL for the economy. Very few countries support the arts because the arts are considered to be a luxury. There are many more developmental challenges that are deemed to be much more important. The corporate sector is very weak, and so there's a lot of dependence upon international funding from within the African cultural space. S for a social dimension. If one looks at one of the things that we do as the Sustaining Theatre and Dance Foundation, we work within marginalized communities in Cape Town amongst community art centers. And one of the key challenges that they encounter is violent criminality. So that would be a social problem arising out of the deep-seated inequalities and the marginalization of people within South Africa. So every second week or so, their art center would be broken into and equipment would be stolen. So that's a huge kind of social problem that militates against sustainability. Similarly, in terms of social questions, who are the people with disposable income to be able to support creative industries? In our particular context, there are very few countries that have markets that can sustain creative industries. So it's imperative for African creatives to travel into international markets to derive the sustainability for their particular activities. In fact, one of the other things that I used to do was serve on UNESCO's technical facility around the 2005 convention. And the 2005 Convention on Cultural Diversity basically almost makes it an obligation of Global North countries to provide preferential access to Global South countries and the products and the creative products from the Global South. For us to be talking about limiting travel by Global South actors into the Global North is in fact a major contradiction of the 2005 Convention to which all of us subscribe. Then there's the T in PESTEL. Sorry, I'm going on a bit, but just to create context.
We started earlier, take your time.
T for technology. North Africa, Nigeria, and South Africa are probably the major users of technology on the continent. The digital divide across the continent is enormous. Most people consume or have access to the internet via the phone, so that what it also showed during COVID was that people consume the arts, if they do, through a very tiny device. Also, the cost of data makes it incredibly difficult for people to use their telephones for browsing purposes. They tend to use it mostly for functional purposes because of the levels of poverty on our continent as well. 70% of Africans get up in the morning and make their livings within the informal sector. They do not get up to go to a job where they get paid a weekly or monthly wage. So that, for them to be considered to be markets for creative industries is just not a reality within the African kind of conditions. For ecological, of course, we consider the environment as being one of the factors in sustainability, but not because Africa has contributed to climate change in the ways that wealthier countries have. 7 of the 10 most vulnerable countries in the world in terms of climate change are African countries. At the very top of them is Mozambique. I can assure you that the climate change experiences that they are having have got nothing to do with international travel. L of pestle, the legal, so sometimes the hoops through which African actors in the cultural space have to jump in order to be able to be sustainable. The Public Finance Management Act in our particular case, the requirement for audited financial statements, all things that would be taken for granted in other contexts are hoops through which it's very difficult for some of the actors in our space to do. And then the plus C is about culture, the different kind of value systems, the belief systems, the ways of making identity that impact on sustainability as well, because in some contexts, religious beliefs, cultural taboos militate against the practice of the arts in ways that we would assume and take for granted in more kind of liberal contexts. Then there's the old kind of basic SWOT analysis to look at the internal factors with regard to sustainability, right? Like, do we have leadership? If leaders go from particular organizations, quite often those organizations collapse because they don't have the human resources, they don't have the succession planning. Infrastructure, equipment, security of the goods that they have, internal kind of financial security because of the dependence upon international funding. So all of these are factors that go into making up the matrix, to use Ukona's word from yesterday, of sustainability within an African context, which is fundamentally different to the emphasis on climate change within a much more Western European context. And so maybe just to end off this kind of introductory session or part by saying that to concentrate on climate change as the primary element of sustainability, for me, really is an extension of privilege, because it does assume that all the other factors that I've alluded to are in place, that they are there, they are taken for granted, so that now we can concentrate on climate change, which has to do less to do with the sustainability of a festival or a theater or whatever, but more to do with the sustainability of humankind and of the earth, right? And maybe just to end off in terms of like this idea of privilege and how the notion of travel is something for us to talk a little bit about. I'm just walking to one of the workshops yesterday with 2 colleagues from Western Europe. They were telling me how that they arrived here, which was amazing. They took a train and a ferry to get here. It took them 2 days though, and it cost them 4 times the amount of money than if they had just taken a flight. So in other words, if we silo climate change in terms of sustainability, we compromise a whole bunch of other dimensions of sustainability as well. And that you can only do if you are in a privileged context, which we in Africa are not. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. So you talked about everything that we will talk about in this forum. So we can go now. No, but we will elaborate more and expand on parts of what you just said. Thank you very much, Mike. And I will ask Sarah, what is just to put the context, because maybe some people are new also today, what is sustainability for you as an artist, as a curator, as someone who's running a collective? What does it mean for you?
I think it organically follows from what Mike said, and like I would be speaking from the voice of one of those organizations that has a question of sustainability as a critical question all throughout. So we are a collective that existed since 2017, but our life expectancy as an artist and curatorial collective in Addis Ababa is at least 1 year. So we're still vulnerable for extinction, and we don't have that infrastructure of permanence. And we exist only through the work that we do and bridges our projects from one side to another. So we exist with the work that we do for our next project. So some of the frameworks that we use so that we exist and we sustain is, one thing is to, for example, to remain curious and also question what collaboration means among ourselves and among others. So we've experienced collaboration as a framework that enforced us to sort of grapple with the idea of empathy and foresight. And what this means is, so we prioritize the means before the end. Because collaborations could not go to the end until we concentrate on the quality of relationship that we have with our collaborators. So that's one form of us sort of sustaining our collaboration, is to take care of each other. So there's also a shift that we experienced in our practice where we sort of like changed our object of care from the artistic production that we made to the artists themselves. So caring for artists before caring for the art object. And what this shift facilitated is the idea of, or the question of what infrastructures need to be in place for us to constantly ensure that our primary concern is each other's well-being. And the answer for this that we found is to always make space for conversations and dialogue. So what we did as artists and curators is, how do we deal with conversations and dialogue as an art form? How do we converse with each other artfully? And this sort of also expanded our viewpoints with the question, how do we critically coexist with difference? So difference in terms of opinion and difference in terms of identity and the like. So each of these shifts are existential for us, so which means each time we experience this shift, we sort of like morph and change in form. And this idea of like remaining malleable and remaining soft and open is, I guess, the reason for us to exist beyond the 1 year limit that our environment sort of not dictates, but sort of is the norm there. But, yeah.
Yeah, so this is also your way of creating local strategy. So it is a part of the solution, how you are dealing with this. Thank you very much, Sarah. And I want to focus again on the problem. So Mike, what's the real problem here? Like really, is it a real problem? Is it a fake problem? What is the problem? And whose problem is it? And why this problem is happening? So this is like, yeah, please.
Yeah. So I think that the real problem in our world is that the two major fault lines for me are inequality and culture. Mm-hmm. So inequality with regard to who has political power, who has economic power, who has military power, and who has cultural power, who has the ability, in other words, to project their values, their ideas, their perspectives on the world through mass media, through whatever means that they have. And, you know, as a consequence, the global north or Western kind of countries tend to have a dominance with regard to the military, with regard to political power, with regard to economic power as well. And when we talk about the other key fault line being culture, it's about the different value systems that we have, the different belief systems, the different ways that we make meaning, the different ways in which we collectively and individually understand ourselves in relation to others. And quite often, conflicts that are rooted in inequality come to be textured by these cultural differences. And I think that one of the things that we're encountering in dealing with climate change is just the fundamental differences with regard to who is responsible for climate change. Mm-hmm. And then to place the burden of mitigation on climate change on those who are most vulnerable and least responsible for climate change is completely and patently unjust. You know, 4 regions, the USA, Western Europe, Japan, and Canada, represent about 12% of the world's population, but they are responsible for 50% of the greenhouse gases that have been emitted over the last 170 years. Mm. Africa, by contrast, has been responsible over that period of time for less than 0.01% of emissions into the atmosphere. And yet, as I said earlier, African countries are overwhelmingly the most vulnerable, amongst the most vulnerable countries in the world. So there's a huge responsibility on wealthy countries to be playing much more of a role in terms of mitigation. And one of the, why I think that this particular forum is really important, and I think that the fact that, On the Move is having this particular forum here is really good. If I could just say to my colleagues from the Global North, please go back with this message to policymakers and to your colleagues in the Global North, that to expect Africans to bear the brunt of mitigation strategies and so on is just completely ahistorical. Africans have basically been used to drive the economies of the Global North historically. People were forcibly taken from this continent to work as slaves on the plantations and other places of the Global North in other parts of the world. And that's how wealth, through the colonial project as well, came to be developed. And yet today, we would frown and say that, we are anti-slavery, we are anti the colonial project. And yet so many of those historical injustices continue to be perpetuated right now. Yeah. Just take the issue of mobility. The average European passport can get you to about 190 countries without a visa or visa on arrival. The average African passport can do that for 60 countries. Where in the world would we, if we just looked at it objectively, how can we even consider that to be just? So it is fundamental. The historical injustices in our world are so embedded in the structures of things that we have come to accept that when we are dealing with things, we're dealing with things symptomatically. We're dealing with the consequences of inequality or the symptoms of inequality rather than with that which has caused the inequality or that which can change structurally that which perpetuates inequality. And so for me, if we concentrated on the movement of Africans into Europe in particular as a way of limiting climate change, for me that is to simply perpetuate and reinforce inequality. One of the major contributors to Africa's GDP, one of the major contributors to alleviation of poverty, one of the major contributors to the development of Africa, what is it? Remittances from other Africans who are living abroad and making their livelihoods in other parts of the world, who send back money to their families, to their companies, to their communities back in Africa. That remittances from abroad are amongst the top 5 contributors to Africa's GDP. Again, to limit Africans selling their labor into the international labor market is to perpetuate underdevelopment on the continent. And so this, you asked the question, where does it come from? I really think that a lot of the injustices and inequalities that we're encountering today are rooted in the slavery and the colonial projects. And by not addressing those and by treating the symptoms of that, we are simply perpetuating those historical injustices. So I really would like to appeal to my colleagues to not just go back and talk to their colleagues abroad in terms of their colleagues in Europe about changing policies and the like, but to actually do it with us. Because that's part of the neo-colonial project, is to make decisions on our behalf, to determine sustainability as having a primarily climate change dimension is part of a neo-colonial project. You are setting an agenda which is not consistent with our reality. You need to be working and talking with us and creating new policies that look at the future of humankind holistically rather than in silo kind of terms. And I'm not saying it should be a purely Global South project or a purely Global North project. We need to be working together on this. But I think that if we looked at the way in which we as a world dealt with the COVID pandemic, then I think we need to learn lessons from that, because we kind of, in the same way as climate change represents a huge existential threat to humankind, so the COVID-19 pandemic did as well. And yet the way in which the world responded was not in a holistic humankind approach. It was about wealthy nations hoarding vaccines. It was not about making sure that a continent like Africa, you know, or had access to vaccines, so that potentially we became a factory for new variants of the virus, and so placing humankind at threat as these variants kind of took hold within the world. And so I think that if we are serious about dealing with the future of humankind, as opposed to looking after the interests and privileges of wealthy elite nations that have their wealth rooted in colonialism and slavery, then we need to be taking a very fundamentally different approach now.
Thank you, Mike. This is one thing that I will get back to later, because when you say this is a global problem, so why the solution is not globally created? Why are we in the global south? We are not part of, not receiving the imperatives of the global north, but participating and contributing and engaged, fully engaged in deciding how do we deal with this problem. But we will get back to that a bit later. But I think for my, from everything that I read and thought about, is that, do we really know the size of the problem? Do we really, if we cannot measure it, we cannot manage it, do we have enough information when we talk about cultural mobility and when we are talking about climate change and sustainability? How big is this problem? So I will just ask, how many artists and cultural workers from Tunisia are here today? Can you raise your hand? Okay, not many, so maybe this will not be representative. But if we look at how many artists are traveling from the global south to the global north, and not only in arts and culture, but is this a real problem? And if we look at what you said, Mike, about the contribution of different parts of the world to the problem of sustainability. But also we do not compare, we don't have a benchmark, we don't have a comparison, cultural sector compared to IT, to construction, to the auto industry. Why are we taking this without challenging it? Let me rephrase it. Are we challenging that this is a real problem? Are we basing what we say and what we discuss, this is, as you said, it was this topic and this topic and this topic all the time, the agenda is changing, and now we are talking about cultural mobility versus sustainability, environmental sustainability. So are we basing that on any real information, on benchmarks? Do we have enough information to say what size is this problem?
Yeah. And I think that that's a very good question, and it's a question that I think we really need to be interrogating as people within the sector, rather than assuming that we all understand things to be the same and then adopting, what comes to be. These are the ways in which we need to be tackling the problem. We just assume things without interrogating them. And I think one of the problems with us as an arts sector, certainly from my experience within South Africa and in Africa as well, is that we don't do the reading, we don't do the research, we don't do enough analysis, we don't do enough interrogation of the fundamental things that inform policy. So we tend to be consumers of policy made elsewhere rather than contributors to policy. In which case, we can only blame ourselves if we tend to be victims of policy rather than co-creators. But in terms of your question, I mean, the primary contributors to global emissions are heat and electricity, the burning of fossil fuels to create heat and electricity. 31% of global emissions come from that particular thing. Forestry, 6%, transport, 15%, agriculture, 11%, right? So in terms of global travel emissions account for about 2.4% of greenhouse gases. But even then, if you look at it in relation to other sectors that I've just mentioned now, it is some countries that contribute much more to the 2.4% than other regions. So for example, 10% of the global emissions from the US come from their travel industry. But I mean, everybody travels with a plane every day, 64 times in 1 minute kind of thing. So, their contribution to that 2.4% is significantly higher than those traveling within Africa and from Africa and elsewhere. So that to, again, simply take a one-size-fits-all approach to these things is ahistorical. It's just not consistent with interrogative kind of practice. And I think that the question that you ask, should point to where we go as an arts community, Global North and Global South, working together to interrogate these kinds of things in a way that is analytical, substantial, that is informed by different kind of lived experience in order to influence cultural policy or influence policies with regard to these things, influence funding strategies as well, as opposed to simply taking on board that which is assumed by policymakers who are informed in turn by other kinds of research. So I think that part of the responsibility does lie with us to be doing that work.
And sorry, I will just ask Mike another question before I turn to you, Sarah. Since you are talking about policy, you worked a lot with policy, and there was some things that it did not continue. Can you elaborate a little bit about your work in policy regarding these topics of cultural mobility and sustainability?
Yeah, so as I pointed out earlier, I worked in post-1994 South Africa pretty much in helping to formulate post-apartheid cultural policies, worked with UNESCO on the 2005 convention as someone to work with Global South governments in terms of coming up with policies that were aligned to the 2005 convention. And then most recently, being part of a writing team to draft a new theatre and dance policy for South Africa. Coming out of the COVID experience where, COVID had devastated theatre and dance, and that's where the Sustaining Theatre and Dance Foundation came from. We initiated it from within the sector to try to find ways to energize the sector, to give people some kind of hope that, post-COVID or even once COVID had dissipated, there would still be major challenges for the theatre and dance sector to be able to be sustainable within an environment where there were theatres that had shut down, where festivals were no longer in existence, where the public sector simply wasn't making money available for that. So essentially, it's not that within a South African context there is not money for the arts. There is public funding for the arts, but it's spent on infrastructure that we've inherited from the apartheid past that is no longer appropriate to the conditions in which most people live. So literally millions and millions of dollars get spent on 5 or 6 theatres on the infrastructure that are simply inappropriate for the lived experience of the overwhelming majority of people. And if you take seriously Article 27 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that says everyone shall have the right freely to participate in the cultural life of the community and to enjoy the arts, that places an obligation on the state to provide access to the infrastructure, to the resources for people to in fact enjoy that fundamental human right. But if, on the other hand, you kind of take a different approach and say, well, actually the market shall provide, then those people who historically have been marginalized under apartheid continue to be marginalized under this new system now because they simply do not have the resources to be able to compete and have access to the infrastructure that is located mainly in urban centers. So what we as a writing team did was we looked at what is the money available for our particular sector and just reorientated that allocation away from infrastructure towards funding companies instead, towards funding community art centers, to building a national circuit through which people could travel. And the longer play as a life, the more it is likely to be a stream of income for the participants, right? So it's about creating the conditions in which people could make a living on a more sustained basis than is currently the case. So that's kind of like one policy intervention that we've tried to do. And 2 weeks ago, we got a letter from the presidency to say the policy has been approved in principle. It can now go through the parliamentary processes. Look, I've been working in this area for a while to know that you hold your breath. You don't hold your breath, rather, because even when you have great policy, it comes to be implemented by people who happen to be appointed into positions of power who simply have no idea and who pay, and who genuflect upwards in terms of the kind of hierarchy within a department rather than serve a particular community. So there's always the need, and it's not only at a local level, but at a global level as well, that on the one hand, there is the need to consistently try to influence and change policy for the better, because if one does arrive at a point where policy is progressive, where the funding channels that follow are consistent with progressive policy, fantastic. But don't assume that. Always work on parallel methods to ensure that your sector is going to be sustainable despite rather than because of government or because of policy kind of support.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Mike. I will get back to some of the points that you mentioned, but this is a global problem, and as we just said, that it should be a global solution. So maybe we should focus a little bit on the solutions. And as Yukuna said yesterday in the panel, like, we don't start looking for sustainable solutions, local solutions. We have been doing that all our life, yeah? We look for solutions of the problems that we are facing. And in our local context, we are faced with so many consequences of climate change. We live, I come from Jordan, you come from Ethiopia, so many of you can relate to this. We have scarce resources when it comes to culture, but also to like resources like water, and having to deal with extreme climate changes and issues resulting from that. If we will talk about strategies that you, Sarah, and your collective and the artists around you, you found, and you think that you are dealing with the problem of this mobility and this issues with the climate change, what are the solutions and the strategies that you are adopting?
I guess maybe I will speak if I was like in a decision-making space.
Yes.
So again, I will try to mention like an artistic practice as a way of addressing this question. How do we come to this decision, or how do we try to think about a solution? And I agree that it needs like some form of radical change, a fundamental change to inequality in mobility, or understanding a sustainable mobility. So I would like to mention the idea, or like the artistic practice of future thinking, which is starting from this present reality, how do we bridge to the future we want to see? And one of the tools that we use is dreaming, right? Mm-hmm. So I think dreaming is a very empowering tool. It allows us to sort of dissolve the boundaries that exist practically or tangibly, like, for example, the power of the passports that we have that limit our mobility. And what this does is it sort of allows us to work from a space of abundance instead of scarcity. So what we're doing is we're imagining an ideal situation, and we're finding out how to achieve that, instead of not being able to see a different and radical solution or possibility. And for me, from my understanding and the way that I actually relate with mobility, I think we haven't met each other enough. We still categorize and identify each other through these geographic terms as global north and global south, without actually really like dealing or plowing through these meanings. And I feel like that comes from this idea of like not being in each other's presence, not hosting and inviting each other's enough. So for me, the radical, I guess, solution is actually to increase and be in each other's presence, to move more, to meet each other, but also change the language of mobility. So like things like not as immigrants and people that accept immigrants, but as hosts and guests, and all the practice that comes, and the humanity and the values that come with hosting people as people, and not just like this labeled identities of, I would say that would be my, if I was in a decision-making process, I would work from that ideal of increasing mobility and making mobility a human right to all, and then solve from that space.
Thank you. Thanks, Sarah. And I'm thinking about the equity versus equality. The concept that we are not all starting from the same point. So in this topic, in cultural mobility and its impact on culture and on environment. So starting from equity versus equality, where we don't, in the global south, we don't come from a point that is equal to our peers in the global north. And we don't have the same infrastructure. I cannot, and you said you come from Cape Town to Tunisia, you have to fly like half of the world to be here. And in Europe, I can just take the train from Sweden to Prague, okay? but still, so there are infrastructure, there are resources that allows the global north to be in a better position to respond to this issue. What do you think, Mike? How do you think about this? Is this a right way to think about it, that we should, as you said, no one solution fits all? Should the artists in the global south, when it comes to cultural mobility, be given a different way of dealing with this than the artists in the global north? Should it be solved on one's expense if it's a global problem?
Yeah, so clearly, I mean, the difference between equality and equity is that we are not starting all on the same point, right? So in terms of, you want to have a metaphor, it's like being in a 100-meter race with Usain Bolt, but you're starting at the 400-meter mark.
Yeah.
And so equity would mean that perhaps you would be starting, you'd start at the 50-meter mark, and Usain Bolt would start at, because of, that's the metaphor, right? But I mean, having said everything that I've said also, I just do want to say, though, that the Global South is not homogeneous, right? The Global South also has differences in terms of access to skills and resources and so on. And I come from a country that, in many ways is equitable to Europe in terms of how we deal with people from other parts of the African continent. Ours is an incredibly Afrophobic country. And accessing South Africa is as difficult for many Africans as it is for them to access Europe. It's just that we are closer than Europe, and we have a more corrupt border police, so it's easier to kind of get into the country than it is to cross into Europe, probably. But when I'm talking about these kinds of things, South-South collaboration and South-South kind of mobility is something that needs to be factored into this as well, that things are not easier simply because we are traveling in a global South kind of context. It might be to some extent, but not always. And I think that these are some of the, that's why I was saying we need to look at this globally and not as an us and them or a binary kind of thing, but how do we look at the problems that we are and the challenges that we're encountering holistically and come up with nuanced kind of proposals as to how we go about dealing with it, even from not just a regional basis, but a country-to-country basis in terms of where the priorities should be for a particular period of time that we determine together.
Thank you, Mike. I will move a little bit to the brilliant yearbook of On the Move. So this year's 2 articles by Yukon and Salim, they were brilliant. And I would like to ask Sarah, you read the 2 articles, and I would really want to know what are your conclusions, what are your thoughts about the article when you read them? Articles.
I think they both resonated with me a lot, but I would like to mention one aspect maybe that we didn't mention in terms of mobility from Ikona's article, and that is the idea, for example, with we spoke about mobility of people, but not artworks and productions when it comes to visual arts. So a lot of the time, there would be art that is showcased in a different place without the artist being present, and I feel like that's a very incomplete way of showcasing and sort of representing works. And that also addresses this idea that we are increasingly global in terms of mobility and also digital. But I think this increased global identity calls for more nuance and for us to engage more locally and identify ourselves and also know that those details and specificities about each other. But these kind of structures where care is given more to the object and it is being showcased in different places and almost like a cultural export, but the artists and the cultural workers are not, there to give context as one way of sort of fragmenting the work that is being done. So that point really resonated with me.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And I will ask now questions to you both, and you choose if you want to answer or not. When dealing with a problem, trying to find a solution, it's either maybe 2 ways to be either structured or creative. Do you see any structure in us as a sector dealing with this mobility impact on climate and on environment in general? Do you see a structure there? Do you see that we are, as a sector, using our creative power in finding solutions? Because I think yesterday, was it yesterday when, I think it was Salim who was talking about a project where I thought that was creative. What was the name of the project? Archibald? Huh? Oh, Oli, yeah. Thank you. And so I would ask you about, did you see any structures in dealing with this problem, or did you see any creativity in dealing with this problem during your work? So it's up to you if you want.
Oh, please go ahead. I'm hoping.
Look, I mean, I think that, you know, when faced with particular challenges, we within the arts and culture sector, we have the capacity for both. And we do need to embrace both. We need to be able to use our creativity in order to raise consciousness about the kinds of challenges that we are facing. But at the same time, we need to be looking at how do we engage with the structures that lead to the challenges in the first place, and how can we then contribute towards changing those structures. And in that regard, I think also one of the frustrations I think that I have with us as an arts sector is that we work in a silo. And you know, we do not work with other sectors of our society in bringing about change. And I think that this is something which I really am frustrated by within a South African context, where we complain about being victims of policy, of poor funding and the like, but we don't collaborate with other sectors of our society who are also trying to bring about fundamental change. And I think that that's what we need to be doing. We need to be at the COPs. We need to be working with, you know, all of our colleagues who are working to bring about fundamental change at a whole range of other levels. We need to be contributing creative ideas. We need to be contributing and not be overly precious about sometimes being instrumentalized in order to use the creativity to raise consciousness and awareness about some of the key challenges. You know, the notion of not being instrumentalized within, again, an African context, may I say, is a bit of a luxury, because there are so many challenges that are encountered. If I can maybe just, on this notion of sustainability, just talk a little bit, if you don't mind, about something which I'm trying to do at the moment as a playwright, right? So as a playwright, as an artist, although I work in the level of policy and so on, I face exactly the same challenges that other artists face with regard to building a sustainable practice. So last week I opened a new piece, a piece of satire that I'm hoping to travel for the next year in the build-up towards our elections next year to get rid of our current corrupt, inept, incompetent, greedy, venal government that has been in power for 29 years, fuckers. Anyway, so the way that I'm dealing with it in terms of sustainability is that A, it's a one-person show. Right? I don't have resources to be able to have more than one person. Secondly, I'm directing it. I've never directed any of my own work in the last 29 years. It's always been someone else, but simply no resources, so I've directed it. Thirdly, although it's opened at a theatre space in Cape Town, the primary way in which we are going to be distributing this is in people's homes. So we're building up an alternative circuit of taking the play into people's homes, where the host basically invites his or her friends and family and neighbors, and they come along and they pay a particular ticket price, or they see the work and they make a contribution afterwards. We have a particular price, or what we'd like to earn on a weekly basis in order to sustain the work, but ultimately we work in a not one-size-fits-all way. If we're in a poorer kind of section today, then that's what the income will be. If we're in a wealthier section, that will be the case, and so on. So, but at the same time, also building a different model of trying to generate income. I'm fortunate in that I've been in this practice as a playwright for a while, so I've been able to attract individual angels who like my work, and so they would give, you know, $10,000 or whatever towards a new play, and so I'm grateful for that, and I recognize my own privilege and luck in that. But I'm also trying to build a subscription model, which is something that we try to do for the Sustaining Theatre and Dance Foundation. Through the COVID experience, I think a lot of us came to see that the models that were most sustainable were those that were based on subscription, right? So you have the Netflix and the Showmaxes, and where the top news platform in our country, Daily Maverick, is based on subscriptions, right? It doesn't exist, well, it does now as a paper, in a weekly paper form as well, but essentially it has 17,000 subscribers that allows it to employ the journalists who deliver the content on a daily basis to us. So I'm thinking, well, why don't we have a similar kind of thing in the arts? So what I'm trying to do is, if I can get to 400 or 500 subscribers, and on a monthly basis, I offer them particular benefits like a reading of one of my plays or an interview with, you know, a top director or whatever, that could be a way in which I have a regular source of income through a subscriber base that would then allow me to be able to do the work that I do. So it's also about experimenting at a very local, individual, me as a playwright level about how do I build sustainability that has not over much to do with travel and climate change, but it's about making sure that I'm able to pay the rent, have food on the table and the like. So, yeah, you know, I think that there are different models that prevail throughout the world, and particularly within areas where there is a lack of infrastructure, where people are, and that's what I've found working across the African continent, that precisely because of the lack, there was incredible ingenuity and creativity. And I think that we can all benefit from tapping into that when we are faced with these kinds of challenges that we are, when funding kind of dries up or gets cut or gets shifted elsewhere.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, I think this is what's happening, that our creativity is focused on the content rather on the methods and ways we are working with and the infrastructures. And I come back to a point that was mentioned in your talk and to what you, Sarah, said about cultural mobility as a human right, or mobility, but cultural mobility as a right for cultural workers. And connecting to what you said, Mike, also, is that about advocacy, okay, and about please to our colleagues to take this message to engage us more, but then you said we should be part of demanding this. How do we build the capacity of local actors and operators and cultural operators? How do we build the capacity of us to be able to demand that we are engaged in all kinds of solutions? We are part and not receivers of solutions. How do we make sure, like, to empower these local scenes so that they are present? And I quote you from a talk. You said our culture, our sector is sometimes naive. So can you elaborate a little bit about this, and how do you think we should raise our voices in a structured, efficient, productive way, rather than victimizing, but being efficient and to the point?
So the only experience that I have in this is that in order for us to be able to influence policy, you need to organize, you need to build networks, you need to have a voice on behalf of the sector that is organized, that has membership, that has strategic leadership, that is informed, that is knowledgeable, and is confident and able to take on these debates and able to intervene in them, and not be people who kind of make up the numbers, who come from Africa to say we've got like 5 Africans and hey, but actually most of the talking or influence comes from the global north, you know? We really need people who understand these things sufficiently and are confident enough, at times maybe not to be polite, but to be robust in our conversations, to make sure that we are heard. That and certainly my experience within a South African context comes from, in order for us to influence post-apartheid policies, we had to organize ourselves into the National Arts Coalition so that we had a voice representative of the arts community that was independent politically, that had elected its own leadership, and that was able to lobby for arts policy, the similar thing that we did with the Performing Arts Network of South Africa. Then took that model onto the African continent and devised arterial network. And because we had a representative structure on the continent, we were now invited to UNESCO to come and have observer status there, to be able to intervene and speak on behalf of the African cultural sector around the 2005 convention, or to be invited by the Goethe Institute to come and talk to them about culture and development policies when they were busy formulating them in Bonn. So it's through organization, through building networks, through having a voice, that one is then invited. When the European Commission has these culture as a vector of development or whatever kind of conferences, then because you're organized and you're visible, you get to be invited. You may not be listened to, but hey, you get invited. And so that's something that I would recommend, you know. But I'm a little bit tired of that now. I'm retiring. but if there's another generation to do it, then that's what should be done. But yeah, anyway, that's an answer to your question.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I think that we are like concluding now. So do you have any final thoughts before we start taking questions from the audience?
Spoken enough. I'm happy to take questions.
Maybe I'll just follow up with the last point, and also see the point from our perspective as we continually see the need for institutionalization, not only to organize, but also as a way of recording the strategies that emerge as we respond to the context that happen. And also moving away from always criticizing institutions are not caring for us, to also look at what those institutions would look like if we build them or if we design them. So yeah,
great. Thank you so much. I think we can take some questions now. Are there any questions? No? No one is? Okay. Yes, Yukuna, please.
I'll introduce myself. I'm Okona Mlandu from South Africa. I don't know if I have questions rather than, and I might even be repeating some of the things that have been said, but I feel the need to say them. So I keep thinking about this idea of like benchmarking and who gets to set the benchmark to determine whether something is legitimate or is moving in the right direction. And I think about how implicit is a certain kind of bias which would come from, which is influenced by who has the power. And I think we've said this. And so, and then I see like a paranoia that is emerging from the global north on this question of environmental sustainability that is based on a scarcity mentality, this fear that something that is mine is about to be taken away, this privilege that I've always enjoyed is about to be taken away by the reality of the consequences of this, you know, of our actions towards our environment. And the natural instinct of self-preservation, which is in some ways different to the ways in which self-preservation plays out on the African continent, because it becomes more innovative. And here, when you feel like you've got something to protect, you kind of close down and you come up with clever ways of excluding those that you think are coming to take away your privilege. And so you see it in the migration conversations, et cetera, et cetera. And so so then it brings me to wonder how it is that like climate action became such a priority, because it's not the only SDG goal, right? Yeah. But for some reason, this was the one that, you know, the powers that we chose to zoom in on. But also at the same time, around that same time, there were interesting things happening in the world around conversations around race, conversations around gender, conversations around understanding, beginning to articulate and speak more explicitly about how resources are distributed, where money is, why it is the way that it is. And then instead of, because remember in South Africa, for example, there was the Rose Must Fall movement, which then became a thing in the world, and people were talking about, so race was a thing. There were a couple of other urgent things that were emerging from society, from lived experience, that we're saying that this is where the world's attention needs to be if we mean it, that we want to redress the imbalances of the past and move towards an equitable way of living. But then somebody sitting somewhere in some office with lots of security guards decide climate action, which is our collective problem. And I'm just like, what kind of nonsense is that? I mean, it just feels like such a derailing and I don't know if tone deaf is the word, just the thing of going, I can hear the noise going on outside, but here inside, we are concerned with this thing, and we're going to turn this thing into an international priority. So like when I realized, I think I realized this when we were walking yesterday, and I was like, what the hell is that? Actually, like, why is it that, you know, we, as a world, we're being co-opted into this emergency that is in some ways manufactured, because as I said yesterday, this thing is not starting because somebody has realized that it's happening. Some of us are living the reality of it. It's on its way, it's restoring, it's doing all the things all at once. And yeah, and on this changing the language of mobility, it's something that I'm thinking through because of, like, another example is another topic altogether. So park all of everything that I've said, but on this thing of changing the language of mobility, one of the things that strikes me, like when, like I've done residencies in the global north, like nobody's gonna come and pick you up from the airport, you're gonna get a map, you're gonna figure it out, good luck, we will, and I said this in a forum, and we will reimburse you with money that comes from where in a different currency, and then when people are coming to this side of the world, we'll make sure, like we'll figure out how to get a car there. We'll come and meet you. We'll invite you into our homes. We will, you know, we will even show you our secret cultural practices. Not because we don't respect them, but we just love that you came and we want you to be part of us. And so you can see the difference in the ways that we perceive this idea of hosting and hospitality and uku, yeah.
Thank you very much. You can, do you want to comment, Mike or Sarah?
We maybe take a few more.
Yeah, I just cannot let this benchmark thing go. I will give an example, a metaphor, okay? So, I live in Sweden, but where we are not allowed to collect information on ethnicity. And I compare with England, where they can collect information on diversity and people, how many people of color are attending theater or la. They know, they can announce that this is the percentage of people of color who are attending these events or who are working in this sector, and then they see exactly what is the size of the problem. And in Sweden, we cannot. So it is so easy to say, we don't have a problem, or we don't know the size of the problem. So I was thinking about this the impact of cultural mobility on environment. If we say, okay, let's measure different sectors, if cultural sector and creative industries contribute to 1% of the problem compared to IT or to construction, then we know that, okay, guys, you fix your problems first because we are not contributing. We should prioritize our time, our resources to talk about more prior things for us than cultural mobility impact on the environment. So that was just a small metaphor. Thank you. Okay, other questions? Yes, please. And please mention your name so that our online... yeah. Yes, please.
Thank you. My name is Marianne Dievleek. And thank you again, Icona. You mentioned the word hospitality. I've been also reading a lot about hospitality, and maybe in terms of finding what Sarah is saying, radical, ideas and dreaming of ideas, maybe the idea of mobility should always be linked with hospitality. We talk about mobility, we talk about the travel, but we don't talk about the welcome. And that just might bring up some new ideas that also relate to all of the things that you've been saying about sustainability, including equity. And another kind of radical idea that just popped into my head, when we go on the plane, we're asked if we want to contribute to buying trees, something which I'm very skeptical about the value of. But maybe when we travel, we should be in the cultural field. We should be asked to give a percentage to an African mobility fund. That would be cool. You know, like 1 ticket, 2 other tickets. And I'd like to just, you know, maybe ask us in a subgroup or in this group or whatever, to just to dream, as Sarah was saying, and to dream of really radical, crazy solutions. Because although I think, Mike, you said we should be approaching these questions with creativity, policy questions with creativity.
Yes.
We hardly ever do. We always fall back on the same demands, on the same models. Maybe it's because administrators are thinking about these questions and not artists. But I think it would be really fun to just get a bunch of people together and think of real wacky ideas.
Yeah. Thank you
it's a
very
plea.
much.
It's not a question, it's a plea.
Thank you very much. And this is something that the private sector, the business sector, they hire artists to come and sit in the meeting rooms when they are discussing problems to use their creativity and their creative power. And we are not doing this. So we are just letting the managers of the institutions sit the way we think, and our input is really limited and not in our best selves. Thank you very much. Do we have?
Hi, everybody.
Yes,
so it's not a question, but I want to really share something with you, with my head, of course, of producer and director in this beautiful venue, as you said. You know, we talk with Mike when we met more than 10 years ago, or even when I worked more than 20 years ago in the theater. We are always talking about that problem of mobility, and especially in Africa. But there is something new, and in my opinion, it's really new and a bit dangerous than before. The first thing is, after COVID, there is something really changed in the world, like the digital. I had very bad experience after COVID. We used to travel in very difficult way, but we succeeded. We traveled like 8 times with our production a year, or between 8 and 10, which is really huge. After COVID, we traveled 3 times, and we was like crazy happy. Because some festival, after the COVID, even that there is no wave, there is no, everything is open for Europe or wherever. It happens to me in Europe, in 2 festivals. They said, we want to keep the international side. We want you in our festival, but in streaming. So stay home, we will pay you, but play on your stage. And they wanted to put our names, of course, from Arabic World and Africa, international festival. All the European, of course, traveled to the festival, but they decided to not make Arabic and African companies travel. So the first time we accepted, because we thought that it's an exception after COVID, but when it happens, once again, we refused, and we don't accept. We cannot be just in the list of the artists and not move. The second very important point is really the price of the ticket, and no direct flight anymore, even between 2 near countries. The less expensive ticket flight was, for example, in our production, from Tunis to Lebanon and Tunis to Cairo. Like 500 dinar, it's nothing. So in our center, in our big project, Araf Center, that most of you know, really the cheaper ticket was from Lebanon. I was there 3 months ago, 9 person. We paid like 20,000 dinar for 9 person to travel, so the ticket is 4 times, is around 2,000 each person. So now it's like we are fighting Agnes, a huge problem, the price, of course, the economic issues, but I think that now we become more and more invisible in the big circuit of festivals, and the digital really is a bit dangerous for us, for theater, for dance. And just to end, it's for me very important to say about the Arab Center. So for people who don't know, and I'm very happy to have some of the artists who participate to Arab Center, created more than 23 years, of course, by Azdin Ganoun. The reason of the school is to make a bridge between two important continents or countries, African, of course, and Arab world. We made a bridge first. There is first meeting between person. I remember from Palestine, he said, this is the first time in my life I even talked to an artist from South Africa or from Benin or wherever. We had a very beautiful experience, more than 20 years, when people believe in the importance of this bridge. But now, after COVID, it's really become very hard because I'm feeling like for mobility, the funder want to work like in very small cluster in Word. Now people tell me, if you have someone from my country, I will contribute. If you send training from my side, why we make this school? Because we want to make a power and mobility between our two countries and make a bridge, as I said. And even that kind of very important forum like today, cultural mobility, it's like for the word or that kind of project, now it's become like a dream. They only want, I think, I'm feeling, I hope I'm wrong, that the majority of policy or of funder after the COVID, priority of the very small sector, I heard that, for example, in France, priority to program French people or very close, we don't have enough budget, we are in crisis, you are so far, problem of visa. So I'm really frustrated, really, because I'm really afraid of the sustainability of the school. More than 20 years we succeed. But now it's like we need to work like only with Tunisian or only with 2 or 3 countries, and it becomes harder. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And I agree with you. I think, yes. I think it's very important. I think sometimes this whole discussion is coming from the place of protecting privileges. So you're right. Yeah, thank you very much for sharing with us. Any other questions? Yes, please.
Hi, Maria Dai from Morocco. You were telling that private companies invite artists to share with them creative ideas. I always think that perhaps us, as artists and cultural professionals, we are in a huis clos, you know. We work together, we speak together, and we are talking about a global issue, which is ecology and environment. Perhaps we can add in our groups experts, because now we are assuming things that mobility is a danger or Africa have to participate, but perhaps we can, if it's like we are talking about health without doctors.
Yes, absolutely.
Now we are talking about environment without experts. We need data, we need the reality, we need to ask our ideas and questions, because I think that it's time of questioning, not answering yet. Perhaps that we can add this to have a real context in the beginning of that big forum with numbers, data, etc. That was.
Thank you so much. I think, the yearbook had some really good numbers, but this connects to what Mike was talking about, that we work in silos. We as a cultural sector sometimes are so peaceful. Like, we should be more aggressive, and I'm talking also about we should be more aggressive. We should be aggressive in a good way, like just with a strong voice and backed with numbers, backed with facts, backed with connection to other sectors. Yes, thank you very much. We have more questions? Yes, please. We have time, so we started
There
early.
is one question here. After, there is also one question from the online forum.
Yes, please.
Thank you. My name is Tihana. I'm from Cooperativa, which is a network operating in the Balkans. Just to give a little bit of a context here. And thank you for everybody for the contributions today. This is really very inspiring and I think quite pertinent to a lot of the topics and talks that we are also having within our geographical context. So this is more of a comment or kind of, I felt invited to contribute to this discussion because I mean, there's a lot of things that have been bothering me lately, you know, in a lot of these discussions. And one of them is the question of language, because I feel as somehow we have like globally been blackmailed into using this liberal language, which I hate, you know, and kind of naturalizing through it a lot of the things that are not natural, but are kind of spring out of, you know, social relations. So there's nothing, you know, privilege is a way that we naturalize. When we say privilege, that's a way that we naturalize social relations. You know, there's nothing natural about somebody being born into wealth. Inequalities are not natural. They are a product of social relations. So, you know, rather than saying privileges, I would say like what we're talking about here is combined and uneven development. You know, the question of periphery and center, and like who has the access to the power, to the wealth, to being in a position of power. These are all questions of social relations and economy. So, and it's pertinent for us as well, because these social relations get translated into cultural policies. So, you know, when you talk about like maybe we should be the ones like how do we influence cultural policies, we're never in the same position as the ones who are actually lobbying for these things. Because we can have all the data and all of the analysis, and we usually do have it. You know, whenever we come, all of us, we do the research. Like, there's nobody here who is not doing the research, not reading, not thinking about the concepts, not producing the data, not producing the analysis. But we never have that one analysis that actually makes the difference when you come into these, you know, decision-making processes. And that's like, how much money are we going to gain from this? And, you know, the fossil industry comes there, and they're like, ah, yes, let's push the green agenda. We're going to give you this much money from it. The concrete, you know, we were talking about all of the businesses that actually make the most of the emissions. They are the ones who are contributing most to the greening policies of the EU. It's not the eco-activists out there. It's the ones who are actually producing the things that we are living now. And we, you know, so this is, I think a question is also like, how do we become the subjects that can leverage this? Because there is no, I mean, we can talk to the policymakers in Europe, but just look at who is sitting in the EU Parliament. We don't really have the left anymore. There's no organizational form that could actually back us with the power and the resources that are needed to push for these policies, to properly push for them in a systematic way. So it's also, I think, for our sector, always kind of a question of like, okay, we're getting, you know, we're trying to kind of, while we are trying to figure out the ways in which we will organize in the mass and have a collective voice, I always feel that we are kind of taking on the role of like, how do we revive this left, you know? We're talking about like, okay, meeting more and having these discussions. And we used to have a name for this. It was called internationalism, you know? And it was a big part of the project of the left. And I'm sorry if I'm being like hyper-political here, but I mean, these are all really hyper-political questions that we are addressing and that can unfortunately have a limited effect in the kind of arenas where we can come to just to take part and not even get to be heard. Because even these political structures, they don't have the power that they used to have anymore. You know, Goethe Institute doesn't have power anymore. UNESCO doesn't have the power that it used to have. The UN is not at all, hasn't been for decades, an organization that actually represents the world in the way in which it used to represent it. Because the power has also shifted globally. So part of the question, I think, will also be how do we, you know, are we going to battle for these institutions to be preserved in a way? And what are, you know, how are we going to kind of build the new alliances that can be like kind of neither this nor that? And I think this is also like a question which is very, very pressing nowadays within the conflict, the new conflict that has, you know, been brewing since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which is actually kind of a conflict between a proxy war between China and America. So this is the new global stage. And there's something really rotten with the social relations that we live, because they are also dissipating. Capitalism is going through its structural change, and who knows what's going to be on the other end of this. So, you know, I fully support this idea. Like, you know, why we are discussing here, how do we contribute to climate change? But why should we contribute to the climate change? I mean, to the you know, like as a cultural sector, not as like people who are invested in political, proper, you know, collective actions, but as a cultural sector. Like, why should this even be a question for us? This is only a question for us because that's how we get funding from the European Union. I'm sorry, I mean, at least from us who are coming from the Balkans, you know. This is not at all pertinent for our, for instance, geographical area. What's pertinent for our geographical area is how are we going to fund arts and culture? Why don't we have public cultural institutions where they're close to independent cultural artists? Why, you know, cultural production has been completely nationalized? These are the pertinent questions for my geography. Or, for instance, why you can get with the train from Stockholm to Prague, but not from Zagreb to Tirana, or even from Zagreb to Belgrade anymore. No, sorry, yeah, I'm going to stop.
Thank you so much, Tihana, for this brilliant intervention. Yes, thank you. And we have one online question.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
Yeah, there is one question from Suleiman. I think it's from Morocco. How can we develop a new business and ecosystem model that allow us to sustain the sustainability of cultural project and initiative? Quite a big question.
Okay. Sarah and Mike?
No, Sarah.
Oh,
No, look, I mean, that's too big a question to answer in the time that we have left. But maybe just to pick up on some of the other points.
Yeah.
I think what Serene was talking about now, you know, during the COVID times, there was this notion of pandemic expediency, where precisely in order for us to deal with the pandemic, governments loved it because they were able to take people into lockdown, they were able to take away people's civil liberties and the like. So this notion of pandemic expediency, and I fear that the same is happening with climate change, that there's climate change expediency, that, you know, for the greater good of humankind and addressing climate change, actually maintaining Fortress Europe is, you know, what is behind some of the strategies that are there. And I think that we need to be vigilant about it, we need to expose it, we need to confront and challenge it, absolutely. I think also, you know, the notion of international travel, this is probably like the 5th seminar workshop that I've been part of to do with sustainability relative to climate change in the last 8 months, most of them kind of hosted by European partners. In one of them, there was some interesting research that was shared by a German festival that showed that there were more CO2 emissions from the people who came as an audience to that festival than the artists who travel internationally. So again, it goes to the question that Fairooz asked at the beginning. Are we doing sufficient research as the cultural sector before we adopt the strategies that we believe are the ones that need to be addressing climate change, such as international travel? So maybe instead of, you know, limiting African international travel, we need to be turning down our heaters a bit more in Europe. In order, we need to maybe turn all our festivals and restaurants into vegan restaurants because of the contribution of agriculture and cattle farming to climate change and the like. So, in other words, why are we addressing this particular one that affects people from the global south really detrimentally, when there could be a whole bunch of other things that are done within the wealthiest countries where the responsibility for climate change really lies. I think also, to come back to Corner's point about, if you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, there are 17 of them, completely integrated in terms of how they are wanting, you know, a future of humankind to be built into this integrated, sustainable kind of paradigm. But we are concentrating on one or two aspects. And if you look at the evolution even of this notion of sustainable development, at one time they spoke about the economy and social development as being the two pillars, right, of development. And then there was the Brundtland Commission in 1987 from the United Nations, and as a consequence of that, ecology became the big thing. So that became the third pillar of sustainable development. And what is sustainable development? The ability of this particular generation to look after its needs without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. And this is why ecology and climate change are so important within this notion of sustainable development. But within the cultural space, there have been movements as well by people to have culture to become the fourth pillar of sustainable development, precisely because of culture being the transversal impact that it has on a whole range of these sustainable development goals. How, for example, can you be pursuing Sustainable Goal 5? Women's empowerment without addressing patriarchy, which is like a fundamental cultural, phenomenon in like 2/3 of the world's countries. But those debates are kind of lost. And that's where we as an arts and culture sector need to be active. That's where we need to be engaged as well. But we are absent from those. And as the colleague from Eastern Europe said earlier, we tend to take on those things that we get funding for rather than setting an agenda that arises out of our own analysis and critique of where we are and where we are located within the world.
Thank you very much, Mike. And I think we ran out of time.
Oh.
So, sorry?
Just
yeah.
I think we are going to the end of this panel, but maybe there is still some time for Sarah maybe to react.
Yes, of course.
I think I'll just respond to all the comments that you've heard and
please.
sort of so maybe from the last point about how do we design sustainable business models, I can speak a little bit about Ethiopia. I guess a lot of the time we promote art and try to promote the vitality of culture and the need for it, for people to give it value, not just conceptual value, but also financial value. But I think one way is to sort of like direct this promotion or this invitation towards our intimate circle. So like, I mean, from my practice in Addis Ababa, a lot of the time our families are like absent from like our exhibition opening, and our intimate circle are like we give free tickets to people instead, to our friends instead of asking them to buy. So like these small practices that are directed to the people that we actually hold influence over, I think could grow into like a community practice where people value and know that they would have to like pay for art and to sort of experience it. And another thing, maybe like it relates to like the what we learned from like the COVID or like its effect, and also why we take on, or like how come we're taking on cultural mobility as our urgency. Not answering it, but some point that comes out of that is I think it also helps us to maybe see a different way of dealing with urgencies, because I think there was the way we dealt with Corona and COVID and is this way of like reacting instead of responding. So this idea of like we're told it's an emergency and then reacting immediately, sort of to reconsider that, and also like, just take time and sort of respond to anything that comes as urgent. Do I have another? No, I think that would be it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mike. And thanks to all of you. Please.